He only bumped the handlebar, a soft graze on his way past the row of parked motorcycles. But the biker, Diesel Rex, didn't see an accident. He saw an old man in a faded jacket and decided that was enough reason to strike. One loud crack, and Art Peterson, an 88-year-old veteran, collapsed to the pavement, hands still gripping the bread he just bought. The bar crowd stared. Phones stayed in pockets. Not one soul stepped forward. But 30 minutes later, the silence shattered. The sky pulsed with blades and a Black Hawk descended onto Main Street. Soldiers in tactical gear spilled out like a storm was coming. Because that wasn't just any old man. That was someone's father. And someone's unit was watching. If you believe dignity doesn't retire with age, hit like, type, respect, in the comments, and subscribe, because this story proves some uniforms never come off. Most people passed by Arthur Peterson without a second glance. He was just an old man in worn boots, shuffling past the same bar he'd passed every Thursday for the past 15 years. 88 years old, retired Army mechanic, 3 deployments, 2 citations, and one body that didn't work the way it used to. He didn't complain, didn't ask for honor or pity, just a quiet seat at the diner, a hot coffee, and time to walk home with the help of his cane. That morning was colder than most. Arthur wore his old olive jacket, Army issue from 1983, patched in the sleeves but still warm. On his left chest, the faded imprint of a name tag that once read A. Peterson. He stepped out of the corner deli, a small paper bag tucked under one arm. Bread, cough drops, and a postcard he meant to send to his granddaughter, Sarah, at the academy. Sarah, bright and sharp, was the reason for many of his quiet smiles. They spoke weekly, her voice a beacon from the chaotic world. He imagined her in her crisp cadet uniform, far away, building a future he fought to protect. He told her stories of his service, not the bloody ones, but the ones about camaraderie, about knowing the person next to you had your back. He often wondered if she truly understood, or if it was just old man ramblings. Today, he hoped the postcard, a simple scenic view of the town's small lake, would bridge that gap, a piece of his peaceful routine connecting to her ambitious new life. Across the street, a group of bikers had gathered outside a bar, loud, laughing, leaning on chrome machines polished like trophies. Arthur paid them no mind. He'd seen men like them before, full of bluster, looking for a stage. He didn't fear noise. He'd seen worse sounds in places where silence meant danger, places where the only sound was your own heart hammering in your chest, waiting for the inevitable. The bar, the Iron Horse, was a new addition to the block, replacing a quiet bookstore. He'd heard stories, rumors of trouble, but Arthur lived by a simple code: mind your own business, treat others with respect, and expect the same. It was a code forged in foxholes, honed by decades of living. As he made his way past the bikes, his coat caught a handlebar. Just barely. The motorcycle rocked but didn't fall. Arthur stopped immediately. Turned around. Hands up. Didn't mean to touch it, son. My jacket's thicker than I thought, he said with a small, apologetic smile. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't careless. He was just old and kind, a man whose reflexes weren't what they once were, whose body moved with a different rhythm than the young. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a lifetime of quiet observation. He saw the gleam of malice in Diesel Rex's eyes, the way the biker puffed out his chest, asserting dominance over an imagined slight. This wasn't about the bike. This was about power, about picking an easy target. But Arthur, despite his trembling hands, stood his ground. He met Diesel's gaze not with defiance, but with a weary resignation, a knowledge that some battles just couldn't be avoided. But the tallest biker, Diesel Rex, stepped forward, sunglasses glinting in the noon. Son? He didn't ask questions. He didn't inspect his bike. He slapped Arthur across the face. The sound echoed off the brick walls, a sickening crack that seemed to hang in the air for a moment, an unnatural punctuation mark in the mundane rhythm of the street. The old man hit the sidewalk with a soft grunt, one hand still clutching the paper bag as it tore. Bread rolling into the gutter, scattering like broken teeth. The laughter from the bar didn't stop, a cruel, indifferent soundtrack to his humiliation. No one moved. No one spoke. The few passers-by averted their gaze, suddenly fascinated by their shoelaces or the distant traffic. A woman inside the diner, Brenda, a waitress he knew from his Thursday morning routine, peered through the window, her hand coming up to her mouth, but then she turned back to her table, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Someone at the bar, a man in a plaid shirt, sipped a drink and turned his chair, as if a quiet morning show had just been interrupted by static. Arthur didn't cry out. He just sat up slowly, one knee trembling, face flushed with more humiliation than pain, and began picking up pieces of bread from the street. His movements were deliberate, each crumb a testament to his shattered dignity. He felt the sting on his cheek, a raw, burning sensation, but the deeper ache was in his soul, the shame of being so utterly dismissed, so easily broken. He'd faced down enemy fire, seen comrades fall, but this casual act of cruelty, witnessed by so many, felt like a fresh wound. Arthur's cheek burned, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he reached for the crumpled loaf of bread, now speckled with dust and motor oil, and placed it gently back into the torn bag. Like it still mattered. People kept walking. A couple, Mark and Lisa, crossed the street, their hurried steps and averted eyes a clear signal of their desire to be anywhere but here, to see anything but this. Brenda, the waitress, peered through the diner window again, her face a mask of internal conflict, then turned back to her table, busying herself with wiping down a counter that was already spotless. The biker who hit him was already laughing with his friends again, their raucous hoots echoing across the street. No apology, no fear, just the certainty that no one would challenge him over a quiet old man in a faded jacket. Arthur stood slowly, gripping the metal pole beside the bus bench for balance. His cane had rolled a few feet away, a forgotten limb. He limped to retrieve it, bent down with a soft groan, a sound that was more soul-deep than physical, and winced, not from the pain, but from the weight of being seen and ignored, the crushing realization of his own invisibility. He sat on the bench and exhaled shakily, the cold air biting the inside of his lungs. His hearing aid buzzed faintly, a persistent hum that mimicked the ringing in his ears, but his pride buzzed louder, a furious, silent roar. Back in 1970, he'd pulled 3 soldiers out of a burning jeep outside Kisan, their screams echoing in his memory even now, their faces burned into his mind. He'd risked his life without a second thought, driven by an ingrained sense of duty and brotherhood. Now, in 2025, he couldn't even get a stranger to hand him a paper towel for the blood at the corner of his mouth. He looked at the few droplets on his sleeve, crimson against the drab olive, a stark reminder of his vulnerability. A teenager walked by, earbuds in, oblivious to the drama unfolding just feet away. Arthur raised a hand just slightly, a tentative gesture for help, but the boy didn't see, or maybe didn't want to. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was looking for proof he still existed, that his years, his service, his very presence still held some weight in the world. He felt the weight of every silent witness, every averted gaze. Their inaction, he realized, hurt more than the blow itself. It was the collective turning away, the societal shrug, that truly bruised his spirit. Inside the bar, Diesel Rex lit a cigarette, the glowing tip a small, defiant star in the dim interior. He leaned back on his stool, regaling his buddies with a distorted version of events. He should have watched where he was going. Damn, Grandpa walked right into it. Nearly messed up my paint job. His friends, a hulking man named Vinny with a bald head and tattoos snaking up his neck, and a nervous, wiry guy named Spike, laughed on cue, their false bravado a shield against their own insignificance. Vinny slapped Diesel on the back. Serves him right, the old coot. Always in the way. Spike just nodded, eyes flitting nervously towards the door, a flicker of unease in his otherwise vacant stare. Arthur's jaw tightened on the bench outside. He could almost hear their words, their sneering disdain. He had been called many things in his life, soldier, husband, dad, sergeant. But worthless had never made the list, not in his mind, not in the minds of the men he served with, not in the eyes of his son, Scott. Still, he said nothing, just adjusted his jacket, wiped his lip with the corner of his sleeve, and reached into his pocket. Inside was a cell phone, not much more than buttons and a cracked screen, an antique in a world of smart devices, but on the screen was a single contact labeled Eagle 6 emergency only. This wasn't a casual contact. This was the lifeline, reserved for moments of dire need, moments when the quiet strength he carried within wasn't enough. It was Scott, his son, his rock, his connection to a world that still understood duty and honor. He tapped it once, a precise, unhurried motion, then leaned back and waited. There was no anger on his face now, no pain, just a profound stillness, the calm before a storm. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in sleep, but in a silent communion with the decades of discipline that allowed him this composure. He imagined Scott's face, younger, sharper, but with the same steely gaze he saw in his own reflection, a mirror of their shared heritage. He knew Scott would answer. He always did. Their bond was forged not just in blood, but in a shared understanding of responsibility, a silent pact to always stand for what was right, even when the world chose to look away. He could almost feel the presence of his ancestors, the quiet pride of men who had fought for this land, for this freedom, for the right to walk these streets without fear. 15 minutes passed. Arthur didn't move from the bench. Didn't look angry. Didn't look scared. He just sat upright, quiet, like he was waiting for a bus no one else could see coming, a phantom vehicle arriving on a schedule known only to him. His gaze was fixed on nothing in particular, yet seemed to encompass everything: the chipped paint on the lampposts, the swirling leaves in the gutter, the indifferent faces of the people passing by. Each tick of his antique watch felt like a drumbeat, counting down to something inevitable. He heard the muffled laughter from the bar, the distant drone of traffic, the chirping of a persistent sparrow. But beneath it all, he was listening for something else, a different kind of sound. Then came the low, distant thrum. It started as a faint vibration in the pavement, a tremor that seemed to originate deep within the earth, then rise through the concrete, a subtle warning. A few diners looked around, their conversations faltering. Someone stepped outside the bar, a young woman with a piercing in her nose, squinting at the horizon, trying to identify the source of the growing rumble. Then the sound thickened, a deep, rhythmic pulse that made glasses on tables tremble slightly, a resonant hum that vibrated in the chest. The bartender, a burly man named Frank, stepped out to check the noise, his brow furrowed. "That's not a truck," he muttered, a hint of genuine confusion in his voice. And it wasn't. From beyond the tree-line, beyond the rooftops, emerging like thunder on wings, came the unmistakable silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter. It appeared suddenly, a dark, predatory bird against the midday sky, growing larger with terrifying speed. Low, fast, and headed straight for downtown. Phones came out, held aloft like offerings to the approaching spectacle. Shoppers froze mid-stride, their bags dropping to their sides. Dogs barked frantically from passing cars, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Within 60 seconds, the Black Hawk was descending into the empty field behind the row of shops, its rotor wash whipping up dust and debris, a miniature tornado of raw power. The air filled with the scent of jet fuel and the roar of the blades, a sound that swallowed all other noise. A second later, a matte black SUV, polished to an intimidating gleam, pulled up from the opposite direction and screeched to a halt outside the bar, its tires squealing in protest. Doors opened in unison, a choreographed display of efficiency. Boots hit the pavement with synchronized thuds. Not one man raised his voice, not a single shout or command was heard. A dozen figures in tactical gear, faces grim and focused, stepped out, eyes scanning, movement precise, economical, as if they'd done this 1,000 times and never once got it wrong. These weren't ordinary men, they moved with the silent confidence of predators, each step purposeful, each glance a calculated assessment. Out of the helicopter, one man stepped forward. No sunglasses, no swagger, just command in every line of his posture, in the rigid set of his shoulders, the unwavering intensity of his gaze. He was younger than Arthur, but not by much. Maybe early 50s. Broad-shouldered, jaw set, eyes like steel, reflecting the cold, hard efficiency of his training. He walked straight toward the bench where Arthur sat, his stride unwavering, a force of nature moving with grim purpose. Arthur looked up, blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement, and nodded. It was a silent conversation, a recognition that transcended words. The man didn't salute. He knelt, his tactical pants brushing the grimy pavement, an act of reverence performed amidst the chaos. "Scott," he said quietly, his voice, though low, carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the lingering helicopter roar. One hand, strong and callous, brushed the dried blood from Arthur's cheek, a gentle gesture that betrayed the warrior beneath the uniform. "I got here as fast as I could." Arthur didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In that moment, a profound sense of relief washed over him, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the warmth of knowing he was seen, truly seen, and that his silent suffering had been witnessed and answered. Because in that moment, the biker, Diesel Rex, still standing by his friends, Vinny and Spike still smug in his ignorance, his sneer fixed in place, turned slowly toward the growing silence around him. The laughter had died on his lips, replaced by a cold knot of dread. He saw the men, a wall of disciplined power, and saw the patch on the lead man's shoulder, U.S. Army Special Operations. Commander Scott Peterson. The pieces clicked into place, a horrifying realization dawning in his eyes. He had just slapped the wrong man. His bravado, so recently a towering edifice, crumbled in an instant, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. A tremor ran through his body, a primal fear he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He looked at Arthur, then back at Scott, the connection undeniable, the familiar resemblance striking even in their different uniforms. The old man wasn't just some old man. He was the root, the origin point of this formidable force, and Diesel Rex had just made the gravest mistake of his life. The street was silent now, a heavy, suffocating silence that replaced the earlier din of sirens and shouts. The biker, Diesel Rex, stood frozen, a statue of terror. His leather vest creaked slightly as his shoulders stiffened, a tiny protest against the sudden, overwhelming pressure. His smirk, so recently arrogant, evaporated like steam off asphalt, leaving behind a pallid, drawn face. Commander Peterson rose slowly from his kneel, his movements fluid and controlled, hands steady at his sides. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't clench a fist. He just looked, his steel-gray eyes boring into Diesel Rex, a silent judgment that was more potent than any threat. Behind him, his men fanned out wordlessly, a perfectly synchronized ballet of trained professionals, forming a semicircle that closed off the entire block. No weapons in sight, yet their presence alone was a weapon, the kind of silent authority that made your spine straighten by instinct, that told you, without a single word, that defiance was futile. Arthur, still seated on the bench, lowered his head briefly, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement, a silent nod to the son who had answered his call, who embodied the very principles he had lived by. Inside the bar, music had stopped. The sudden quiet was jarring, unnatural. Frank, the bartender, stood motionless behind the counter, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a look of bewildered fear. Someone, Chloe, a young woman with bright pink hair who had been laughing loudest before, peeked from behind the blinds, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Brenda, the diner waitress, ducked down behind the bar counter, phone forgotten in her hand, as if hoping to disappear. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a palpable sense of impending reckoning. Diesel Rex took a hesitant step back as Commander Peterson moved forward, his voice quiet but clear, carrying an unnerving calm that made it even more menacing. "Which one of you struck a veteran?" he asked, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the bikers. No one answered. Not at first. Vinny and Spike shifted their weight, their eyes darting nervously. Then Diesel Rex, despite his trembling knees, stepped forward barely, a last-ditch attempt at salvaging some semblance of his former bravado. Arms raised half in mock defense, half in supplication. "Man, it was just some old guy. He bumped my ride," he stammered, his voice cracking. Peterson didn't blink. Didn't flinch. His face remained impassive, betraying no emotion. "That old man," he said, his voice dropping slightly, each word imbued with a chilling weight, "served this country while you were still learning how to spell your own name." A ripple passed through the onlookers, a collective gasp. Someone recording on their phone, a college student named Liam, muttered, "Oh damn," his voice barely a whisper, realizing the full gravity of the situation. The biker scoffed, trying to hold on to a shred of his rapidly diminishing bravado. "You military types think you can just roll in like you own the place, huh?" Briggs took one step closer. Only one. But it was enough to erase the distance between patience and consequence, between measured calm and decisive action. "I didn't come here to threaten anyone," he said, calm as a loaded gun, each word striking with the force of a bullet. "I came here because my father bled on a sidewalk while cowards laughed." He turned slightly, raising a single finger toward one of his men, a soldier named Miller, whose face was as grim and resolute as his own. Miller nodded and stepped back, speaking into a radio clipped to his vest, his words quick and clipped, a silent signal of the coming storm. 2 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up, sirens off, lights cold and silent, a stark contrast to the earlier cacophony. This time, the cops didn't look bored or annoyed. They looked cautious, their faces reflecting a clear understanding of the situation's unusual authority. Peterson didn't explain. He just pointed at the biker. The officers understood. The cuffs clicked shut, not in rage, but in quiet resolution, the metallic sound echoing in the unnatural silence, a definitive end to Diesel Rex's reign of terror. The biker didn't resist. There was no point. The moment those cuffs clicked, his confidence dissolved like cheap ink in the rain, leaving nothing but a pale, pathetic shell of his former self. As the officers led him toward the cruiser, a strange stillness fell over the block, a collective held breath. People emerged slowly from doorways and windows, as if waking from a spell, their faces etched with a mixture of shock, relief, and dawning realization. Arthur still sat on the bench, his hands resting on his cane, his expression unreadable, a silent patriarch observing the aftermath of a storm he had quietly summoned. Commander Peterson returned to him quietly, his powerful frame crouching again to eye level, his gaze soft yet intensely focused on his father. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice filled with a son's concern, a stark contrast to the steel he had projected moments earlier. Arthur nodded faintly, then offered something almost like a smile, a fleeting hint of the mischievous glint his eyes once held. "I've had worse, Scott," he muttered, the words raspy. "But not in front of so many people who did nothing." That line hung in the air, a quiet indictment that resonated with everyone who heard it, a truth that cut deeper than any physical blow. A woman with gray-streaked hair, the same Brenda from the diner, took a tentative step forward, then another. Her eyes, filled with shame and regret, were downcast as she approached Arthur, holding out a clean handkerchief, its white stark against her trembling hand. I should have said something. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Arthur took it gently, his weathered fingers brushing hers, a silent acknowledgement of her belated courage. He nodded, a small gesture of forgiveness, and then it began. A ripple of change, starting subtly, then growing. A young man near the coffee shop, who had been engrossed in his phone, slowly removed his baseball cap, holding it over his heart. A father lifted his child onto his shoulders, whispering something urgent into his ear, pointing towards Arthur. The child's eyes, wide and curious, fixed on the old man. A boy no older than 10, inspired by his father's words, stood ramrod straight and saluted, clumsy but earnest, a tiny gesture of profound respect. The crowd around the bar slowly transformed. Phones lowered, hands extended, not in protest or anger, but in a quiet offering of solidarity. No one shouted. No one cheered. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about respect. Long overdue. One older man, Thomas, a grizzled veteran with a weathered flannel shirt, stepped forward, his chest tight beneath the fabric. He stood at attention, his posture rigid, his eyes moist with unspoken understanding, a retired sailor. Another joined him, Michael, a former Air Force mechanic, his movements slower than Thomas's, but his salute just as sharp. And just like that, a small line of veterans formed along the sidewalk, shoulder to shoulder, a silent guard of honor for one of their own. Scott stood back and let it happen, his presence a silent pillar of strength. His team didn't move. They watched silently, like they knew this moment wasn't about them, wasn't about the show of force. It was for a man who never asked for thanks, never sought recognition, but had finally earned it publicly, in the eyes of a town that had forgotten him. Arthur sat a little taller, not out of pride or arrogance, but relief, a profound sense of lightness, as if something heavy had finally been lifted off his chest after years of being carried quietly. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. It was about every time he'd been overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, the anonymous faces in the crowd, the dismissive glances, the quiet moments of loneliness that had accumulated over a lifetime of selfless service. And now, finally, he was seen. Truly seen. By evening, the video had made its way across the internet, a wildfire of raw emotion. The slap, the silence, the Black Hawk, the arrest. No music, no edits, just raw footage that didn't need dramatizing. The title that went viral was simple, powerful. Respect the Elder, Arthur Peterson's quiet strength. Within hours, local news stations picked it up, their anchors serious, their voices tinged with a newfound reverence. By morning, it was on national broadcasts, breaking through the usual noise of political debates and celebrity gossip. They didn't just report the incident. They told his story. Sergeant Arthur Peterson, Army mechanic, Gulf War, Kosovo. 3 bronze stars, 1 Purple Heart, and until yesterday, completely invisible. A segment featured grainy black and white photos of a young Arthur in uniform, a vibrant, determined soldier, a stark contrast to the frail old man seen on the street. Fellow veterans, some tearful, called in to share their own stories of anonymous service, echoing Arthur's quiet dignity. The bar, the Iron Horse, issued a half-hearted statement. Unfortunate incident, not representative of our values. We condemn all acts of violence. But people remembered the laughter, the turnbacks, the closed doors. They weren't forgiving it. Online petitions quickly circulated, calling for its closure. The mayor, Mayor Thompson, a shrewd politician who understood the shifting winds of public sentiment, called Arthur's son, Commander Scott Peterson, personally. He spoke with hushed respect, asking if the city could honor his father with a community event, a token of appreciation from a grateful populace. Scott, ever the pragmatist, said only, "If it's for him, not for press, he'll show up." He knew his father's humility, his aversion to fanfare. Within a week, the town green had been transformed. What was usually a quiet park with a few benches and a rusty swing set now buzzed with activity. A stage had been erected, adorned with a large American flag. Rows of folding chairs, hundreds of them, stretched across the grass. An entire middle school chorus, dressed in their Sunday best, rehearsed the national anthem, their young voices clear and hopeful. Banners hung from lampposts, emblazoned with slogans like, "Honor our heroes," and "Dignity never retires." Local businesses, suddenly eager to associate themselves with the burgeoning wave of patriotism, set up concession stands, offering free hot dogs and lemonade. Arthur arrived in a wheelchair this time, not because he was weak or unable to walk, but because someone, a young volunteer named Emily, finally offered to push him, and he let them. It was a small act of surrender, a concession to the care he had always resisted, a symbol of allowing himself to be supported. The crowd, numbering in the thousands, rose as one when he was wheeled to the front, not out of obligation, but out of something heavier, something profound, a recognition that dignity, when restored, becomes contagious, spreading like wildfire through a community starved for moral clarity. Mayor Thompson, usually verbose and theatrical, read a prepared speech, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. He spoke of service, sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of America. But what people remembered, what truly resonated, was the voice of Arthur's son. Commander Scott Peterson stepped to the mic, his uniform crisp, his posture ramrod straight, and paused for a long moment, surveying the sea of faces. The wind, gentle now, rustled the flag behind him. "My father didn't raise his voice," he began, his voice deep and clear, carrying effortlessly across the vast crowd. "He didn't fight back. He didn't need to." A collective intake of breath. His life spoke louder than anything fists could say. He turned to his father, his steel-gray eyes, usually so unyielding, now glassy with emotion, reflecting the love and admiration he held for the quiet man in the wheelchair. "You taught me what strength looks like, Dad. And now the world knows it too." He stepped down, the silence that followed more powerful than any applause. Arthur didn't speak. He just raised one hand in acknowledgement, his fingers trembling slightly, but his gesture firm, slow, deliberate. The ovation lasted nearly 4 minutes, a sustained roar of respect, a tsunami of gratitude. Not for medals, not for revenge, but for every quiet act of service no one had clapped for until now, for every lonely watch, every sacrifice, every moment of selflessness that had gone unnoticed. It was a collective apology, a promise that they would see him now, and every other quiet hero like him. A few days later, Arthur received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten, shaky, with no return address, just a postmark from a nearby town. Inside were 6 words, stark against the plain white paper. "If you'll meet me, I'll listen." It came from the biker. From Kevin, as Arthur now knew his name. At first, Arthur didn't respond. He had every right to ignore it. No one would have judged him for walking away, for letting justice take its course. He thought of the burning sting on his cheek, the shame, the indifferent faces. But something in the way the letter was written, the uneven lines, the ink smudged at the edges, almost like a tear had fallen, reminded him of another broken man from long ago, one of his own from the service. A young private named Miller, fresh from a tour, haunted by unseen horrors, angry at the world, destructive, but not beyond reach. Arthur had spent weeks with Miller, listening more than talking, offering a quiet presence until the young man found his way back. He saw a similar desperation in Kevin's scrawled words, a raw plea for understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. He asked his son, Scott, to arrange a short meeting before the biker's court hearing, specifying no press, no uniforms, no grandstanding. Scott, though skeptical, trusted his father's judgment. He knew Arthur had a way of seeing past the surface, into the heart of things. In a quiet courthouse room, stripped of all pomp and circumstance, with no cameras and no uniforms, only a few stern-faced bailiffs standing by the door, the man who had once slapped him sat hunched forward. Kevin. He was stripped of his attitude, his leather vest replaced with a plain, ill-fitting button-up shirt. His hands were clenched, knuckles white, like he was bracing for impact, for another blow, a verbal lashing that he felt he deserved. Arthur entered slowly, leaning on his cane, the only sound in the room the soft tap of its rubber tip on the polished floor. He didn't speak at first, just sat across from him with a veteran stillness that could silence an entire room, a quiet authority that emanated from decades of holding steady under pressure. Kevin wouldn't meet his gaze. "I didn't know who you were," the biker muttered, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a raw, exposed shame. "That's the problem," Arthur replied gently, his voice soft, almost paternal, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "You didn't care." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding Arthur's steady gaze. "My dad was a soldier too," Kevin confessed, the words tumbling out, a lifetime of suppressed pain spilling into the quiet room. "Vietnam. Came back shattered. I grew up hating uniforms because I thought they took him from me. He was never the same." Arthur nodded slowly, a profound understanding in his eyes. "I knew men like him, Kevin. Lost just as much as they brought home. The war doesn't end when you leave the battlefield." There was no lecture, no punishment, no self-righteous indignation. Oh, just a quiet space where truth finally stood up straighter than pride, where vulnerability replaced bravado, where raw honesty could breathe. Kevin wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand, tears running freely now, unashamed. He slid a folded paper across the table. Judge's orders or not. He choked out, his voice thick with emotion. I'm starting therapy. Signed up to volunteer at the VA downtown. I want to earn something back. For him. For you. Arthur looked at the form, then at the man who had once knocked him to the ground, at the raw humility in his eyes, the desperate plea for redemption. He reached out, his weathered hand, the same hand that had clutched a torn bread bag, lay gently over Kevin's clenched fist. You won't earn it fast, Kevin, he said, his voice a low rumble. But every day you show up, every day you try, you'll get closer. Kevin nodded, unable to speak, his tears a silent torrent of remorse and hope. That meeting would never make headlines, never be seen by the world, but it changed two lives in that quiet room, forging an unexpected, unlikely bridge between victim and aggressor, between old wounds and the path to healing. 6 months later, the corner of Broad Street and Ellison Avenue looked different. Where once there had been silence, a quick glance away, now stood a bronze plaque mounted on a polished stone wall, gleaming in the sun. It read, "In honor of Sergeant Arthur Peterson, a quiet shield between us and chaos." Beneath it, a single line etched deeper than the rest, a powerful summation of his life. He never asked to be seen. He simply stood. People paused now when they passed. Not everyone, not every time, but enough. Enough to make a difference. Students from the nearby high school, on their way to class, would bring flowers on Veterans Day, laying them reverently at the base of the plaque. A local artist, inspired by the viral video, painted Arthur's silhouette into a sprawling mural of community heroes on the side of the deli, his humble figure standing tall amongst firefighters and teachers. And the city council, humbled and perhaps a little shamed by their earlier inaction, voted unanimously to rename that small park behind the bar Peterson Field, a permanent tribute. Arthur still visited on Thursdays, a ritual he wouldn't abandon. Same worn boots, same faded jacket, same slow, steady walk, his cane a familiar rhythm on the pavement. But now, the silence was broken. Someone always waved first. A teenager on a skateboard, zipping by, would nod respectfully, a quick dip of his head. A new recruit from town, fresh out of basic training, would stop to shake his hand, his grip firm, his eyes full of awe. A father, holding his child's hand, would point him out to his son or daughter, not as a legend, but as an example, a living embodiment of quiet strength and perseverance. Kevin, the man who had once struck him, now drove veterans to and from the VA twice a week, a dedicated volunteer. He wore no uniform, but his actions started to fit like one, each selfless act a stitch in the fabric of his redemption. Sometimes Arthur saw him at the diner, helping a frail vet into a booth, his large hands surprisingly gentle, or carrying someone's groceries to their car. They never made a show of it, never exchanged grand speeches. Just small nods, a mutual acknowledgement of a shared, unlikely journey. Warriors on different ends of the road, walking it in the same direction now, their paths converging in a shared purpose. Commander Peterson returned only once after the ceremony, a brief visit between demanding deployments. He and Arthur sat on the same bench, the one where Arthur had waited that fateful day. No need to speak much. Their bond was deep, a silent understanding forged in shared sacrifice and unwavering love. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, painting the buildings in hues of orange and purple. After a while, his son simply said, his voice thoughtful, "You taught them something, Dad. You changed this place." Arthur smiled faintly, watching a boy tie a small American flag to his bicycle nearby, its tiny banner fluttering proudly in the evening breeze. "Maybe," he mused, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Or maybe they just remembered what mattered." That night, as the wind rolled through the trees near the bar, rustling the leaves, the sound of distant rotors could almost be heard again. Not from the sky this time, but from memory, an echo of power and swift justice. And if you stood long enough, closing your eyes, you could almost hear it. The moment a town stood still. Because one man refused to fall alone. If you believe respect shouldn't come after pain, if you believe some uniforms never really come off, hit like, type, honor, in the comments, and subscribe.